Good evening. I'm Lyndon McIntyre. Tonight we devote a full hour, with no commercials, to the war in Iraq. Not to the military campaign or the machines of war, but to the politicians who decided upon this course and the people who will live with the consequences. Bob McEwen will join us later with a story of promise, betrayal, and the Iraqi Kurds. But we begin with the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Until mid-March, the eyes of the world were on the UN Security Council, where the diplomats tried and failed to avert a war. But so far, little has come to light about the dealings behind the scenes in London and Washington, all those phone calls and meetings between George Bush and Tony Blair. It seems an act of faith bound these two men together and set the world on a course for war and perhaps much more. The bell tolls midnight at the beginning of a war to change the world. A war devised by people determined to create a new world order in a new American century.
Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure.
Show weakness now, and no one will ever believe us when we try to show strength in the future.
It is a war that has fractured Western alliances and emasculated the United Nations. It happened when a neoconservative U.S. president with a dubious mandate and a disinterest in foreign affairs bonded with a socialist prime minister, a champion of international consensus and one of the most popular politicians in Britain, until now. In the countdown to war, Tony Blair's alliance with George W. Bush became one of the great political mysteries of recent history. It has cost him the affection of his people and the solidarity of his party. 139 of his own MPs voted against his call to war. 3 ministers resigned.
The reality is that Britain is being asked to embark on a war without agreement in any of the international bodies of which we are a leading partner. Not NATO, not the European Union, and now not the Security Council.
The truth is our Prime Minister has been ill-served by those he sought to influence. By a US administration that has seemed at times to delight in stressing its disdain for international opinion.
With all this, Graham Allen, a Labour MP and former party whip, helped lead the Labour Party mutiny.
This just makes no sense in terms of the objectives that we have in our foreign policy. We're going to create more terrorists. We're going to undermine the alliances that we have. We're going to devalue the United Nations. We're going to split our own Prime Minister from his party, his parliament and his people.
In the tumultuous weeks before the war, he seemed oblivious to public or party opposition. For people close to Tony Blair, his defiance was a shocking departure from a famous fidelity to the whims of public opinion.
He wouldn't choose a tie without consulting a focus group. He wouldn't say anything without seeing how it was going to play in the opinion polls.
I'm just going to translate into... Andrew Ronsley, associate editor of The Observer newspaper, recalls a prime minister once called Tony the Timid.
But there's another side of Tony Blair, which certainly in his first term in government tended to be very subordinate to that first Blair, Tony the Timid, and that's Blair the Bold. We occasionally saw Blair the Bold in expression in the first term, but not that often. And this is a man who, when he discovers what he believes in, when he finds a cause he's really committed to, goes at it with a courage, many would say recklessness, which astonishes people.
Preoccupations of the British are never hard to spot. They're written large in the pages of the countless newspapers that blossom daily here. You only had to pick up one of them to realize that Prime Minister Tony Blair has a crisis on his hands. The Daily Mirror, for generations the voice of the British Labour Party, but no longer, it seems, the voice of the British Labour leader. And it wasn't just the papers. On prominent TV programs, he encountered withering disapproval.
The Prime Minister has today faced a sceptical British public on a special Newsnight debate to try to convince them of the case for war with Iraq.
A question referred to you, by the way, Prime Minister, as Vice President and Honourable Member for Texas North. But it's not just him. I mean, when a great world figure like Nelson Mandela calls the British Prime Minister the American Foreign Minister, don't you feel embarrassed?
I have huge respect for Nelson Mandela, but I don't feel that I'm doing the wrong thing.
And they have gone out of their way to put him in front of hostile audiences. I think this comes from two things. One, you may say, is vanity, that Tony Blair has a great belief in his own powers of persuasion. I think it's also something about his character, and this is not entirely untrue, a feeling he has, and people around him have, that he's actually always at his best when he's really got his back to the wall.
Do you believe that the people of your country are behind you at the moment?
I think if there were a second UN resolution, then I think people would be behind me. I think if there's not, then there's a lot of persuading to do.
Because I don't share any confidence that the people are behind you at the moment. Everybody that I've spoken to within my circle oppose what's happening at the moment.
As traditional supporters deserted him in droves, the homemakers, the blue-collar socialists, the urban commuters, he found enthusiastic approval in an unlikely quarter. The Tory establishment, and few more enthusiastic than Margaret Thatcher's former foreign policy advisor, Lord Charles Powell of Bayswater.
Tony Blair has from the beginning acted as he thought right, and as he thought best from the point of view of British interests.
Lord Powell's vanity photos present a galaxy of Republican stars. Bush Sr., now Vice President Cheney, Ronald Reagan, the current Secretary of State, Colin Powell, all affectionately inscribed to Charles.
When did Tony, do you think, sign on to the Bush administration project, which was regime change or disarmament of Iraq?
Well, first of all, I think it's a bit disparaging to say that Tony Blair simply signed on to the American agenda.
This is a universal perception, though.
It may be a universal perception. Doesn't mean it's right. I think Tony Blair, like previous British governments, has been at the heart of the conflict with Saddam Hussein's Iraq from the beginning. After all, which country contributed most in 1991 after the United States? It was Britain.
In 1991, however, the previous British government had the support of the UN and the British people. The troops in Operation Desert Storm knew Iraq was the aggressor, and they were in a legal war to liberate Kuwait. In 1991, the enthusiasm of American soldiers was in sharp contrast to the caution of their president. Sir Crispin Tickell was Britain's UN ambassador at the time. He recalls it took a jibe from Margaret Thatcher to animate the first President Bush.
And you may remember the famous phrase when Margaret Thatcher visited George Bush Sr., and she hit him on the knee and said, "George, this is no time to be wobbly." And it was that really caused the American position to turn around.
The Kuwaiti invasion led to a humiliating defeat for Saddam Hussein. He'd never been more vulnerable. Still, the Americans and their coalition partners just packed up and went home. The war was over, but here in Washington, not everybody was celebrating. In fact, powerful hawks in the defense policy establishment were already drafting a secret strategy to pick up where Desert Storm left off. America was the most powerful military and economic force in human history. That power should henceforth be used for the advancement of American interests, even if it meant the preemptive use of force against anyone perceived to pose a threat, even if it meant going it alone in defiance of America's friends and allies. It was a blueprint for American domination of the future, which was one good reason for keeping it under wraps. but the details leaked out. In diplomatic circles, its sheer audacity was stunning. Dame Pauline Neville-Jones was a senior civil servant in the British Foreign Office at the time. She remembers her first reaction to the proposed new strategy.
It sent a shiver down my back. It did. It's not so much that I didn't take a greatly moral view about it. I just said to myself, no country, however powerful, can operate on the world in this way by itself and hope to have friends and ultimately succeed.
Paul Wolfowitz, then U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, was the author of what was being called a new doctrine for American dominance of the 21st century. But when he presented it to the first President Bush, it seems a shiver ran down his spine too. In its foreign relations, America would remain a team player for the moment.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
The 90s were the Clinton years, with the hawks on the hard right out to make the world a safer place for America. It was a wasted decade. Foreign policy was ad hoc and, in their view, spineless. Clinton's former CIA director, James Woolsey.
I would say that attention to foreign intelligence was limited. As a matter of fact, it's rather widely known that in the fall of 1994, after I'd been in the job nearly 2 years, when that little airplane crashed into the south lawn of the White House staff joke was, that must be Woolsey still trying to get an appointment.
Paul Wolfowitz wanted to change that. He and some like-minded thinkers set up a think tank, the Project for a New American Century, calling for a muscular new foreign policy, an invincible military, and the guts to use it. January 26, 1998, in a letter to Bill Clinton, they argued for a policy of preemptive action. Their first target, Saddam Hussein. It was signed by a who's who of radical conservatives, including Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, James Woolsey, and Richard Pearl.
We really thought in a way we were filling a vacuum, because the loyal opposition, the Republican Party, was asleep at the helm. They simply weren't engaging on foreign policy issues. They weren't raising the kinds of questions that we thought it was important to raise.
So you went to Clinton?
We went there principally to urge support for the opposition to Saddam, and we didn't get anywhere at all.
Governor, are you ready to take the oath? Answer. Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
That I will...
3 years later, they were in a whole new ballgame.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Foreign policy wasn't high on the Bush agenda either, but his administration now included at least 10 of the hawks in the Project for a New American Century. Dick Cheney, Vice President. Donald Rumsfeld. Paul Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld's deputy. Richard Pearl, a senior civilian advisor to the Pentagon. They had a manifesto. All they needed was a launching pad, a crisis, as this document acknowledged in late 2000 on the scale of Pearl Harbor. September 11, 2001.
This country changed September 11th, just the way it changed December 7th of 1941. We are going to destroy our enemies.
The foreign policy warriors in the new administration pounced. Paul Wolfowitz left little doubt about what lay ahead.
It will be a campaign, not a single action, and we're going to keep after these people and the people who support them until this stops.
In Congress on September 20th, the President embraces the Project for a New American Century with a single sentence that will have earth-shaking significance for the future.
Any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime.
It was of enormous importance, probably the single most important sentence of his presidency, because it reversed the policy of all previous administrations which had regarded terrorism as a matter to be dealt with by police forces and intelligence agencies. What this president was saying is that we are going to take this war to the terrorists where they live, where they work, where they plan, where they conspire, where they organize, and to the governments that give them the help on which they rely.
With a decisive liberation.
In the gallery, the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Whether or not he realized it, this was the start of a historic political relationship.
So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
The beginnings of this marriage was in the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, when Tony Blair instinctively thought, I think it would be his instinct anyway to express his condolences and solidarity with the United States, but he also instinctively thought, my priority's got to be preventing the United States lashing out unilaterally, and the only way to do that is get shoulder to shoulder with them, because if you're shoulder to shoulder with somebody, you can also get your arm around them and start guiding them about.
Blair's mission would be to guide an angry American president toward the United Nations to seek justice and security through international law. He knew this would be the preference of liberals like Colin Powell, who was in charge of foreign policy. He underestimated the influence on presidential thinking of hawks like Paul Wolfowitz. But not for long. January 29, 2002, the State of the Union address and a blunt warning to the world.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
The hawks were quick to approve. The next day, this statement from the Project for a New American Century. At last, the United States has an understanding of its role in the world. But it didn't play so well across the Atlantic.
The Axis of Evil speech didn't frighten Tony Blair, but it certainly alarmed him. In many ways, his problem can be summarized in 3 words: George Walker Bush. Although it's a caricature to portray him just as some sort of Texan gunslinger, with some help from himself, certainly that view is pretty well established now.
April 6, 2002. Blair visits President Bush at his ranch in Crawford, Texas. By now, there is a close personal bond. Blair is still optimistic that he will guide the president into a constructive working relationship with the rest of the world, even though President Bush has already decided to go to war against Iraq. A crucial countdown has begun. 5 months later in September, a moment of triumph for Paul Wolfowitz, a new national security strategy. A doctrine conceived 10 years earlier was now endorsed by the president. It affirmed his view that the best defense is a strong offense. It was a green light for preemptive strikes against America's foes. It was a radical departure from a foreign policy once summarized as walking softly and carrying a big stick. This was swagger, and the stick was frightening even to their friends, even among supportive British conservatives. A public doctrine legitimizing the preemptive use of force was hard to swallow.
There's nothing new about preemption. It's been practiced by many governments over many centuries, and indeed by the United States in really quite recent cases. Was it wise to publish a doctrine of preemption as a strategic document issued by the President of the Government of the United States? Personally, I think it was a mistake. I don't think you need to do that sort of thing. It is provocative to the international community.
This element in the American political bloodstream that you see cropping up from time to time, and you could trace it back to Goldwater, you could take it through Reagan, certain part of Reagan, through Wolfowitz, and through Rumsfeld and Cheney, is strong. And it's come, in a sense, to a peak. It's come right out into the open. It's been espoused by the administration as a whole in the form of the strategic doctrine.
September 7th and 8th, Blair is at the President's Maryland retreat, Camp David. There is no longer any doubt about American intentions. Blair must now persuade his friend to seek approval for a move against Iraq from the UN. He promises unwavering support and to use his influence to get others on side.
When we start really going out into the international community, I think people will see that this is not something that's been invented or dreamt up in the last few weeks. This is a real and serious issue.
I'm told Camp David, particularly, although George W. Bush wouldn't be hostile to Tony Blair, he didn't really need to be, because he'd get people like Donald Rumsfeld in their private discussions to be very aggressive and sceptical about whether the United Nations was really the course to pursue and why should they do it. I think it was also there, and this is partly where Tony Blair came unstuck, that broadly a deal was done that George Bush would stick with the United Nations on the assurance from Tony Blair that he could deliver the Europeans.
But by February this year, most members of the United Nations were unconvinced of the need to go to war to disarm Saddam Hussein. And Europeans were mounting strong opposition to what they saw as an Anglo-American attempt to manipulate the Security Council.
Une telle intervention pourrait avoir des conséquences incalculables. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
The French foreign minister warns of the incalculable consequences of an unjustified war. Afterwards, a rare display of approval from UN delegates.
Tony Blair's policy since he became Prime Minister has been to act as a bridge between Europe and the United States. That's quite a rash objective to set, because it does mean you risk falling in the middle, or having to choose between one side or the other. And the result is that Tony Blair has been, if you like, stranded on the American shore of the Atlantic.
The UN would ultimately leave him stranded, denying legal cover for an attack on Saddam. It would damage Blair far more than Bush. Former UN Ambassador Sir Crispin Tickell.
The Americans were already set on a course of action, and they didn't really want to do anything except enlist international opinion to their support. They weren't actually in a listening mode, but obviously it was the British Prime Minister's view was different, and he believed that that Bush would listen, and that the weight of world opinion should be brought to bear on the issue.
Was the British Prime Minister foolhardy, overly optimistic, or trying to do the right thing?
I think he was trying to do the right thing, but these are things that are a matter of judgment. I'm sure he was trying to do the right thing. I mean, he's a man of transparent integrity. Whether he was wise in trying to do the right thing is another matter.
It wasn't long before the lights went on in Westminster. The Prime Minister was being used by the Americans.
Well, I think it wasn't until we heard that George W. Bush had a timetable for war, probably in March, that people really started to say, we've got to stand up here. We've got to stop this nonsense.
But it was too late. A week into the shooting war, a majority of Britons have rallied round their flag and their soldiers, and even their Prime Minister. War is a time for solidarity, but it is a fragile truce.
Now, the question Tony Blair will have to ask himself, and it may mean that we're going to need a bit more time and perspective to see what the answer is to this, is whether in the end he was always played for a sucker, that the United States were quite happy to go along the United Nations route because they quite weren't ready to launch military action against Saddam Hussein. They would give him the months, but they were months they needed anyway to build up their forces in the Gulf. And that's a question he's going to have to ask himself, whether in the end they did him over on that and they really didn't have much intention of sticking with the United Nations once they'd reached their military timetable.
The Americans went to the UN seeking legitimacy from the international community. Tony Blair was entitled to feel pleased with his efforts, but it now appears the American performance at the UN was a cynical charade.
I think there were overwhelming practical considerations. One is we weren't ready. So the argument that you've got nothing to lose by going to the UN, you know, it may take a week or 2 or 6 or 8, but we're not going to be ready for 8 or 10 or 12 weeks. So you've got nothing to lose. Second, there's a high probability that you will get the approval of the United Nations, and in that case you'll be in a much stronger situation politically. So why not go to the UN?
This was a war that was inevitable for the architects of a new American century, the beginning of the end of the United Nations as we know it. What, in the absence of the UN, will the foundation of a new world order be?
I think there are two possibilities here. One is the re-engineering of the United Nations, a relaunch in product terms, but with a different charter.
Essentially, what I hear is that the real foundations of the New World Order will be the strength and the values of the United States of America.
The answer is yes, if you include other countries that share those values and who will add their strength to ours.
At least 2/3 of the world do not subscribe to the values of the West, aren't particularly interested in embracing them. What do we say to them?
Let's keep them at a maximum distance, while trying to bring them around to our set of values.
The war to liberate Iraq is also a loud message to others in the region.
That's part of the reason to do it, is to communicate to the mullahs who run Iran and to Kim Jong-il and to Bashir in Syria and Gaddafi and the Sudanese government that the work they are doing, all of them, on weapons of mass destruction, given the character and nature of their governments, puts them very heavily at risk.
Tony Blair may well have signed on for a larger mission than he imagined, and when the costs are calculated, he could be among the casualties.
I think there was a feeling, and I shared it, that Tony Blair could walk on water. But those days have now gone, and whatever else lives on in terms of Tony Blair being a very skilled political operator, being a very effective Prime Minister, being a figure on the world stage, nonetheless those intangibles of faith and trust that linked him almost umbilically to the British public and to his own party have probably gone, never to return.
A long and bloody war will renew the wrath of those who tried to keep him out of it. And even if the war succeeds, he'll be judged for having helped to validate a doctrine that could lead to many wars, on the way to a new world order that most of the world doesn't want.
One of the curiosities of a politician is so often in Britain being called a control freak, somebody who wants to always control everything, is that his fate is not really in his own hands now. It's much more George Bush and the military commanders, particularly American military commanders in Iraq, who will determine the fate of Tony Blair, not he himself.
A postscript to our piece. Tony Blair and George Bush have been meeting today to discuss the progress of the war